Marcus Johnson worked 3 jobs in the coal fields of West Virginia, silently enduring exhaustion to feed his wife and 3 children. For a black man like him, speaking up meant risking everything. Then the mine collapsed, leaving him with shattered legs and dozens injured. The truth surfaced for one day, then vanished overnight. No answers, no justice. But they underestimated one thing: a broken man who refused to stay silent, and a few voices brave enough to rise with him. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. A thin gray mist hung low over a small coal town in southern West Virginia, where the early morning air carried the smell of damp earth and burnt fuel. Streetlights flickered weakly against the fading night, and the distant rumble of trucks echoed through narrow roads lined with aging wooden houses. It was cold, not the kind that shocked the skin, but the kind that quietly settled into your bones. Marcus Johnson stepped out of his front door just before sunrise. He was 41, tall, with a lean but hardened build shaped by years of physical labor. His deep brown skin bore faint scars and lines that told stories no one had asked him to share. His shoulders were broad, but slightly slumped, not from weakness, but from the quiet weight of responsibility. His short, tightly coiled black hair was flecked with early gray at the temples, and his dark eyes carried a steady calm, the kind that came from enduring more than he ever spoke about. Marcus moved carefully, closing the door behind him without a sound. Inside that small house lived everything he fought for. Angela Johnson, his wife, stood in the dim kitchen light. She was 38, of medium height with a slender frame that had grown thinner over the years. Her warm, brown skin and soft, oval face still carried traces of the vibrant woman she once was, but her eyes, dark, observant, and often tired, revealed the strain of holding a family together with too little. Her hair was tied back in a simple bun, and she wore a faded sweater over a long skirt. Angela was gentle by nature, patient with her children, but life had taught her to swallow frustration and turn it into quiet endurance. She held a small piece of bread wrapped in paper. "You forgot this yesterday," she said softly. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that didn't fully reach his eyes but was real enough. "Then today I won't," he replied. Their voices were low, careful not to wake the children. In the next room, Ethan Johnson lay awake on a thin mattress. He was 12, tall for his age but still carrying the softness of childhood in his face. His skin was a warm shade of brown, and his short curls framed wide, thoughtful eyes. Ethan rarely spoke about what he wanted, but he thought about it constantly. Under his pillow was a worn notebook filled with sketches, bridges, machines, buildings. He dreamed of becoming an engineer, though he had never said it out loud. Not because he didn't believe in it, but because he didn't believe they could afford it. Ethan listened to his parents' voices and closed his eyes, pretending to sleep. Beside him, Lily Johnson curled under a thin blanket. She was 9, small and delicate, with soft features and large dark eyes that always seemed to notice more than she said. Lily had a quiet kindness about her. She often claimed she wasn't hungry at dinner, pushing her portion toward her younger brother. No one had taught her to do that. She had simply learned. At the foot of the mattress, Noah Johnson slept restlessly. He was 5, small for his age, with tightly curled hair and round cheeks that had grown thinner over the past months. Even in sleep, his expression shifted as if chasing dreams he didn't fully understand. Noah asked questions constantly, simple ones, honest ones. "Dad, when will we have a bigger house?" Marcus never had a real answer. Back in the kitchen, Angela adjusted Marcus's worn jacket. "You're taking another shift tonight?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Security job, just a few hours." Angela hesitated. "You barely slept yesterday." "I'll sleep later," he said gently. They both knew that wasn't true. Marcus stepped outside again, the cold air greeting him like an old acquaintance. He walked down the quiet street, his boots steady against the cracked pavement. The first job of the day waited underground. The mine was already alive when Marcus arrived. Massive machinery roared in the background, and workers moved like shadows under harsh artificial lights. The air was thick, heavy with coal dust that clung to skin and lungs alike. Marcus greeted a few men with a nod. Among them was Derek Cole. Derek was in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered with a stronger build than Marcus, though not as controlled. His dark skin glistened under the dim lights, and his face carried a constant tension, like a man who had too many thoughts and nowhere safe to put them. His hair was short, slightly uneven, and his eyes, sharp and restless, often scanned the surroundings. "You hear about the new quotas?" Derek muttered as Marcus approached. Marcus shook his head. "No? They're pushing us harder, same pay." Marcus wasn't surprised. Derek exhaled sharply. "Man, one day this place is going to come down on all of us." Marcus glanced toward the dark tunnels ahead. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but not today." It wasn't optimism. It was survival. Hours passed in the suffocating darkness. Marcus worked steadily, his movements precise, conserving energy where he could. Every swing, every lift, every step was measured. He had learned long ago that rushing only led to mistakes, and mistakes underground could cost more than a paycheck. At one point, a supervisor walked by. Mr. Caldwell. He was a white man in his 50s, average height with a slightly heavy build. His pale skin contrasted sharply with the grime of the mine, and his neatly combed hair remained untouched under a clean helmet. His face was narrow, his expression distant, as if the workers were part of the machinery rather than people. Caldwell rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. Authority followed him quietly. He stopped near Marcus. "You're 10 minutes behind on your section," Caldwell said without looking directly at him. Marcus wiped sweat from his brow. "The support beam was loose. I had to fix it." Caldwell finally glanced at him. "Next time, report it. Don't slow production." Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." Caldwell walked away. Derek watched from a distance, shaking his head slightly. "You fix their problems, they cut your time, that's how it works." Marcus didn't respond, because Derek was right. By midday, Marcus's body already felt the weight of the day, but he didn't stop. After the mine, there was the warehouse. Heavy boxes, endless loading, trucks arriving and leaving in a rhythm that never slowed. Marcus worked alongside younger men, his experience making up for the strength he no longer had in excess. One of them, a young man named Luis, barely 20, glanced at Marcus. "How do you keep going like this?" Luis asked. Marcus gave a small shrug. "You don't think about stopping." By the time night fell, the town had quieted again. Most lights were off. Most people were home. Marcus wasn't. He stood outside a small parking lot wearing a security jacket 2 sizes too big. The job was simple. Watch, report, stay awake. The cold returned, sharper now. Marcus leaned slightly against the wall, his legs aching, his back tight. For a moment, he closed his eyes. And in that moment, he allowed himself to imagine something else. A day where Ethan didn't have to hide his dreams. A meal where Lily didn't pretend she wasn't hungry. A house where Noah wouldn't have to ask questions Marcus couldn't answer. He opened his eyes again, because imagination didn't change reality. Work did, or at least it kept it from getting worse. Late that night, Marcus returned home. The house was quiet. Angela had left a small plate covered on the table. Cold food, but it was enough. Marcus sat down slowly, eating in silence. In the next room, his children slept. Angela stirred slightly as he entered, her eyes opening just enough to see him. "You're back," she whispered. Marcus nodded. "I'm back." He sat beside her for a moment, just breathing. Tomorrow would be the same. And the day after that. And the day after that. But for now, he was home. And that was enough. The next morning came too quickly. The sky above the town was a dull, overcast gray, and a cold wind pushed through the narrow streets, carrying fine dust that clung to everything it touched. Marcus Johnson walked the same path as always, his steps steady but heavier than the day before. His body had not fully recovered, but rest was a luxury he could not afford. The mind greeted him with the same suffocating breath of darkness and noise, but something felt different, subtle, unspoken. Marcus noticed it the moment he stepped into the lower shaft. The air felt tighter, as if the earth itself was holding tension. The usual rhythm of machines and voices was slightly off. Workers spoke less, movements were more cautious. Derek was already there, leaning against a support beam. "You feel that?" Derek asked without looking at him. Marcus paused, placing a hand briefly against the wooden beam beside him. It trembled, not violently, but enough. "Yeah," Marcus replied. Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That wasn't happening last week." Marcus scanned the ceiling. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place, but when he focused, he saw them. Thin, jagged lines stretching across the rock above. Cracks, small but not natural. "How long?" Marcus asked. "Couple days," Derek said. "Getting worse." Marcus exhaled slowly. Neither of them said what they were thinking. Further down the tunnel, a small group of workers gathered around a flickering work light. Among them stood a young man Marcus had not seen before. Ryan Cole. Ryan was in his mid-20s, average height with a slim, slightly awkward build. His skin was pale compared to the others, his face still carrying the softness of someone not yet worn down by years of labor. His brown hair was neatly cut, though now covered in dust, and his light-colored eyes moved quickly, taking in details most others ignored. He wore a clean helmet, one that hadn't yet been scratched by time. He didn't look like a miner. He looked like someone who wasn't meant to be here. Ryan held a clipboard, his hands slightly unsteady as he examined a section of the wall. He reached out, touching a crack that ran along the surface. "This shouldn't be like this," Ryan murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Derek let out a quiet scoff. "Welcome to the real job." Ryan looked up, startled. "I'm serious," Ryan said, his voice firm but uncertain. "These support beams aren't aligned properly, and the load distribution, this section is under pressure." Marcus stepped closer, listening. Ryan flipped through his notes. "There should have been reinforcement added weeks ago. According to the reports, this area was already flagged." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly as said, "Reports?" Ryan hesitated. "Yes," he said, "but they were marked as resolved." Derek let out a dry laugh. "Resolved, yeah, that's what they like to call it." Ryan looked between them, confusion mixing with unease. "You mean they didn't fix it?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Later that morning, Marcus found himself alone in a narrower section of the tunnel. The light here was dimmer, shadows stretching unevenly along the walls. He stopped. There it was again. A crack, longer this time, running across the ceiling like a thin scar. Marcus reached into his pocket. His phone. It was old, the screen slightly scratched, but it still worked. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around. No one nearby. Then, quietly, he lifted the phone and took a picture. The flash illuminated the crack for a split second. Marcus lowered the phone quickly, his heart beating just a little faster. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe instinct. Maybe something deeper. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued working. By midday, tension had spread through the crew. Conversations were shorter. Movements were sharper. Derek approached Marcus again, his expression more serious than before. "I'm going to report it," Derek said. Marcus looked at him. "You sure?" Marcus asked. Derek nodded. "We keep quiet. Something's going to happen, you know that." Marcus did know, but knowing didn't make it easier. "Be careful," Marcus said. Derek gave a slight smirk. "When have I ever been careful?" They didn't have to wait long. Derek found Mr. Caldwell near the central control area. The supervisor stood as composed as ever, untouched by the dust and noise surrounding him. Derek spoke firmly, pointing toward the unstable sections. Marcus watched from a distance. Caldwell listened, or at least he appeared to. Then he spoke. His voice was low, controlled, but carried an edge. "If you're having trouble keeping up with your work," Caldwell said, "maybe this isn't the job for you." And Derek frowned. "That's not what I—" Caldwell cut him off. "I don't need speculation. I need results. The reports say everything is within standard." Derek took a step forward. "The reports are wrong." Silence fell around them. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened slightly. "Be very careful what you're suggesting," he said quietly. Derek held his ground for a moment longer. Then he stepped back, not because he agreed, but because he understood. Marcus saw it all, and said nothing. Later, Ryan approached Marcus again, this time more cautiously. "Is it always like this?" Ryan asked. Marcus wiped his hands on his jacket. "Like what?" Ryan hesitated. "Problems getting ignored." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said simply. Ryan swallowed. "I filed an internal note this morning about the structural issues." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze shifted. "And?" Marcus asked. Ryan looked down at his clipboard. "They told me to revise it." "How?" Ryan hesitated again. "To make it less urgent." Derek, standing nearby, shook his head slowly. "There it is," he muttered. Ryan's voice dropped. "They said if I don't, I might not pass my probation." Marcus nodded slightly. He had heard that kind of sentence before, in different words, in different ways, but always with the same meaning. That evening, Marcus returned home earlier than usual. Angela was sitting at the table, working on a piece of clothing under a small lamp. The fabric was thin, worn in places, but she handled it with care, her fingers moving with quiet precision. She looked up as Marcus entered. "You're home early," she said. Marcus sat down slowly. "There's something wrong at the mine," he said. Angela's hands paused. "What kind of wrong?" Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Cracks. The supports aren't holding like they should." Angela's expression tightened. "Then you shouldn't go back," she said immediately. Marcus gave a faint, tired smile. "And do what instead?" Angela didn't answer right away, 'cause she didn't have one. "They're ignoring it," Marcus continued. "One of the guys tried to report it, got shut down." Angela looked down at the fabric in her hands. "Marcus," she said quietly, "this isn't just about work anymore." He knew that. "I know," he said. She met his eyes. "Then please," she said softly, "just think about it." Marcus nodded. "I will." But both of them understood the truth. Thinking didn't change what had to be done tomorrow. That night, Marcus sat alone for a while after everyone had gone to sleep. He pulled out his phone, opened the photo. The crack in the ceiling stared back at him. Still. Silent. Waiting. Marcus locked the screen and placed the phone beside him. Tomorrow he would go back. Because he had to. But this time, he would be watching more closely. The morning began like any other, but the air felt heavier than before, pressing down with an invisible weight that no one could ignore anymore. The sky above the town was pale and still, but deep underground, the mine carried a tension that had been building for days. Marcus Johnson walked into the shaft with slower steps, his eyes instinctively searching the ceiling, the walls, the beams. Every detail now mattered. The cracks had grown. They were no longer thin lines hidden in shadow. They stretched wider now, jagged and uneven, like something trying to break free from within the earth. Dust drifted down in faint, constant streams barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Marcus was looking. Derek stood near the entrance of the deeper tunnel, his usual restless energy replaced by something sharper. Unease. "You see it now?" Derek said quietly. Marcus nodded. "Yeah." Derek wiped his hands on his pants, glancing around as if expecting the walls to shift at any moment. "They still not doing anything." Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Further down, Ryan Cole was already working, though working was no longer the right word. He moved cautiously, his clipboard forgotten at his side, his attention fixed entirely on the structure above. His face had lost the last traces of confidence he carried when he first arrived. Now, his pale skin looked almost gray under the dim lights, and his eyes, wide, alert, tracked every sound. "This section shouldn't be active," Ryan said as Marcus approached. His voice was tighter than before. "I told them yesterday. This needs immediate shutdown." Marcus glanced at him. "What did they say?" Ryan let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but without humor. "They said production can't stop." Derek shook his head. "Of course they did." Ryan lowered his voice. "The support beams here, some of them aren't even secured properly. And the pressure, it's building unevenly." Marcus followed Ryan's gaze. He could feel it now, not just see it. The ground beneath his boots carried a faint vibration, not from machines, but from something deeper, something unstable. Work continued anyway, because it always did. Men moved through the tunnels, swinging tools, lifting loads, doing what they were paid to do, but there was a difference now. An edge to every movement. A hesitation that hadn't been there before. Marcus found himself working slower, more deliberate. Every few minutes, he glanced upward. At one point, a small piece of rock broke loose from above and hit the ground near his feet. It wasn't large, but it was enough. Marcus stepped back slightly, his jaw tightening. Across the tunnel, Derek saw it too. "That's not normal," Derek muttered. Marcus met his eyes. No one said the obvious. Not far from them, a new worker struggled with a load. His name was Thomas Reed. Thomas was in his late 20s, average height with a stockier build, his muscles strong but unrefined, like someone still getting used to the demands of the job. His light brown skin was already coated in dust, and sweat ran down his face in uneven streaks. His short, dark hair clung to his forehead, and his breathing was heavier than it should have been. He was new, and it showed. "Hey!" Marcus called, stepping closer. "Slow down. You don't rush down here." Thomas nodded quickly, trying to adjust his grip. Yeah, I got it." But his hands were shaking slightly. Marcus noticed, so did Derek. "You ever worked in a mine before?" Derek asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, just needed the job." Marcus gave a small nod. That answer didn't need more explanation. Then it happened. At first it was a sound, a deep, low crack. Not sharp, not sudden, but long, dragging, like the earth itself was tearing apart. Everything stopped. For a fraction of a second, the entire tunnel fell into silence. Then the ceiling moved. "Move!" Derek shouted. The world exploded into motion. The ground shook violently, throwing Marcus off balance. The overhead beams groaned under unbearable pressure. And then, one by one, they began to snap. Rock and debris crashed down in a deafening roar. Dust filled the air instantly, thick and blinding. Marcus hit the ground hard, his ears ringing, his vision reduced to chaos and shadow. Somewhere nearby, someone screamed. Another voice cried out for help. Marcus tried to push himself up. Pain shot through his legs, sharp, blinding. He gasped, collapsing back down. Something heavy had pinned him. He couldn't move. The tunnel was barely visible now, swallowed by dust and darkness. The only light came from a flickering lamp that hung at an angle. Casting unstable shadows across the wreckage, Marcus forced himself to stay conscious. "Derek!" he shouted. No answer. "Derek!" A voice came back faint. "I'm here!" It was cut off by a cough. Marcus turned his head, trying to locate the sound. Through the haze, he saw movement. Derek, partially buried under debris, one arm free but the rest of his body trapped. Blood ran down the side of Derek's face. "You good?" Derek called, his voice strained. Marcus tried to move again. Pain surged through his legs, worse this time. "I can't move," Marcus said, forcing the words out. Derek cursed under his breath. "Hold on," Derek said. "Don't!" Another sound interrupted him. A weak cry. Marcus turned his head again. Thomas. The young worker lay a few feet away, trapped under a fallen beam. His chest rose unevenly, his eyes wide with panic. "I can't! I can't!" Thomas gasped. Marcus looked at him, then at his own legs, then back at Thomas. For a moment, everything slowed. The pain, the noise, the fear, all of it faded behind one simple thought: move. Marcus gritted his teeth, reaching forward with everything he had left. His arms strained, his muscles shaking as he pulled himself across the ground, inch by inch. The pain in his legs became unbearable, but he didn't stop. He reached Thomas, grabbing the edge of the beam. "Stay with me," Marcus said. Thomas nodded weakly. Marcus pulled. Nothing. The beam didn't move. He adjusted his grip, forcing more strength into his arms. Pulled again. This time it shifted slightly. Marcus let out a strained breath and pulled once more, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. The beam lifted just enough. "Go!" Marcus shouted. Thomas dragged himself free, collapsing a few feet away, coughing violently. Marcus let go. His body gave out instantly. He fell back against the ground, his vision blurring. Voices echoed in the distance. Rescue teams, lights cutting through the dust, hands reaching. Marcus felt himself being lifted, the pain returning in full force as his legs were moved. He tried to look around. Derek. They were pulling him out, too. But Derek wasn't moving. Outside, chaos waited. Ambulances lined the entrance. Sirens cut through the air, workers were carried out one after another, some conscious, some not. Marcus was placed onto a stretcher, his body shaking from pain and exhaustion. As he was loaded into the ambulance, he caught a glimpse of the mine behind him. Still. Silent. Like nothing had happened. By the time the sun set, the story had already spread. News vans arrived, cameras rolled. Reporters spoke urgently into microphones. A major mining accident, multiple injuries, questions rising. For one brief moment, the world was paying attention. By the next morning, the town looked almost normal again. The same gray sky stretched over the narrow streets. The same trucks rolled past the same worn-down houses. The same people moved through their routines as if nothing had happened beneath the earth just hours before. But inside the hospital on the edge of town, reality had not returned to normal. Marcus Johnson lay on a narrow bed in a crowded emergency ward, his body wrapped in bandages, his legs immobilized and elevated. The pain had settled into a constant, heavy presence, no longer sharp but deep, like something that refused to leave. His face was pale beneath the dust that still clung faintly to his skin, and his eyes remained open longer than they should have, as if sleep no longer trusted him. Beside him stood Angela. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her fingers tense, as she watched every movement around Marcus's bed. Her expression was controlled, but her eyes revealed everything: fear, exhaustion, and something else. Something closer to quiet anger. She had not slept. A nurse passed by briefly, checking a chart before moving on. Her name was Sandra Miller. Sandra was a woman in her early 50s, slightly overweight with short blonde hair tucked under a cap. Her face carried the kind of tired kindness that came from years of working in places where people were always hurting. She moved quickly but not carelessly, her voice calm even when the room around her was not. "You'll need further treatment," Sandra said, glancing at Marcus's chart. X-rays showed significant damage to both legs. Angela stepped closer. "Then why hasn't he been moved?" Sandra hesitated. Just for a second. Then she lowered her voice. "There are administrative delays." Angela's jaw tightened slightly. "What kind of delays?" Sandra didn't answer directly. "You should speak to billing," she said softly before moving away. Angela stood there, understanding more than had been said. Across town, inside a small newsroom filled with the quiet hum of computers and flickering screens, Emily Carter stared at her monitor. Emily was 29, tall and slender, with a focused, almost sharp presence. Her fair skin was lightly freckled, and her chestnut-brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail that had begun to fall apart after hours of work. Her green eyes were intense, always searching, always questioning. She had built her reputation on persistence, on not letting stories go even when others did. On her screen was an article she had written just hours earlier. A detailed report about the mine collapse. Names, injuries, questions, responsibility. It had been published. It had gained attention. And now, it was gone. Emily refreshed the page again. Still nothing. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "What happened to my article?" she called out. From across the room, a man looked up. David Henson. David was in his late 40s, average height with a slightly hunched posture from years spent behind desks. His salt and pepper hair was thinning, and his face carried the permanent lines of someone who had learned to compromise more than he wanted to. His eyes, though tired, still held a quiet awareness of everything happening around him. He stood and walked over slowly. "Emily," he said, keeping his voice low, "we need to talk." She turned toward him. "What do you mean we need to talk? Where's my article?" David glanced around before answering. It was pulled. Emily stared at him. Pulled by who? David hesitated. Then, quietly, from above. Emily's expression hardened. "That doesn't mean anything." "It means exactly what you think it means," David replied. She shook her head. "This is a major incident. People were hurt. We have evidence." David cut her off gently but firmly. "And we also have pressure, calls, warnings." Emily's voice dropped, but it didn't lose its edge. "So we just stop?" David met her gaze. "For now, yes." Emily turned back to her screen, her jaw tightening. For the first time in a long while, she didn't know what to say. At the mine site, the entrance was sealed. Bright yellow barriers surrounded the area, and security personnel stood at a distance, keeping anyone from getting too close. The noise was gone. The movement was gone. Everything had been shut down. Or at least it looked that way. A black SUV sat parked nearby, its windows tinted. Inside, two men spoke quietly. One of them was Charles Whitaker. Whitaker was a man in his early 60s, tall, with a refined posture and a presence that demanded attention without raising his voice. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his tailored suit remained spotless despite the dust around him. His face was composed, his expression controlled, someone used to making decisions that others had to live with. Across from him sat a younger man, his assistant, quietly taking notes. "Make sure all internal reports are aligned," Whitaker said calmly. "No inconsistencies." "Yes, sir," the assistant replied. "And the media?" "Handled." Whitaker nodded slightly. "Good." He looked out toward the sealed mine. For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then he turned away. Back at the hospital, Marcus had begun to understand what was happening. No one had come to explain anything. No representatives, no support, no promises. Only forms. Angela stood at a small counter, speaking with a woman behind a glass window. The woman's name was Karen Doyle. Karen was in her 40s, neatly dressed with sharp features and a voice that carried a polite distance. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, and her posture remained straight, professional, untouched by the emotions on the other side of the glass. "I'm sorry," Karen said, her tone even. "Without insurance coverage, we cannot proceed with extended treatment." Angela stared at her. "He was injured at work," Angela said. "This wasn't his fault." Karen nodded slightly. "I understand, but the company has not provided authorization." Angela's hands tightened on the counter. "So what happens now?" Karen's expression didn't change. "You may seek alternative arrangements." Angela didn't move, because there were no alternatives. Elsewhere, Ryan Cole sat alone in a small office inside the mine's administrative building. The room was quiet. Too quiet. In front of him lay a document, a non-disclosure agreement. Ryan stared at it, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper. His face had lost the uncertainty from before. Now there was something else. Conflict. The door opened. A man stepped in, one of the company's legal representatives. He was clean-cut, composed, with a calm voice that carried authority without effort. "This is standard procedure," the man said. "Sign it and everything moves forward smoothly." Ryan looked up. "And if I don't?" The man smiled slightly. "Then things become complicated." Ryan glanced back at the document. His hands trembled slightly. He thought about the cracks, the reports, the warning signs. Then he thought about his job, his future. Slowly, he picked up the pen. By the end of the day, the town had fallen quiet again. No headlines, no interviews, no questions. The story that had briefly shaken everything had disappeared. Marcus lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Angela sat beside him, silent. Outside, life continued as if nothing had happened. And inside, everything had changed. The hospital released Marcus Johnson earlier than they should have, not because he was healed, but because he could no longer afford to stay. The morning he left, the sky was pale and empty, a washed-out blue that offered no warmth. Angela stood beside him as a nurse handed over a small packet of basic instructions. Rest, avoid strain, return if complications arise. Instructions that felt almost cruel in their simplicity. Marcus sat in a worn wheelchair, his legs stiff, wrapped, and still unresponsive to anything beyond pain. When he tried to shift even slightly, a sharp reminder shot through him, forcing him to stop. Angela thanked the nurse quietly. Marcus said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Back home, reality settled in quickly. The house felt smaller now, not physically, but in possibility. Marcus could no longer walk without support. Even standing required effort, his arms shaking as he leaned against whatever he could find. The man who once moved through 3 jobs a day now measured his strength in minutes. Angela helped him to a chair near the window. "You need to rest," she said gently. Marcus nodded, but his eyes were already somewhere else. By the second day, the bills began to arrive. Medical expenses, unpaid utilities, overdue rent. Angela sat at the table, papers spread out in front of her, her fingers pressing lightly against her temples. Her calm had always been her strength, but now, even that was beginning to fracture. Across from her, Marcus watched. "We'll figure something out," he said. Angela gave a small nod, but neither of them knew how. Marcus tried to find work anyway. On the 3rd day, he pushed himself out of the house using a pair of old crutches someone had given them. Each step was slow, uneven, the pain constant but manageable if he didn't move too fast. The streets felt longer than before. Every distance stretched. Every step cost something. He stopped near a row of trash bins behind a grocery store. For a moment, he just stood there. Then, quietly, he reached down and began sorting through what others had thrown away. Cardboard, old cans, scrap metal. Things most people didn't even see. To Marcus, they were worth something, even if it wasn't much. A man passed by, glancing at him briefly before looking away. Marcus didn't react. He kept working. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood outside a small car wash on the edge of town. The owner, a heavyset man named Bill Carter, leaned against the doorway. Bill was in his 50s, broad, with a thick beard and a voice that carried easily. His face was rough but not unkind, shaped by years of hard work and quiet observation. "You ever done this before?" Bill asked. Ethan shook his head. "No, sir." Bill studied him for a moment. "You look young." "I am," Ethan said, "but I can work." There was no hesitation in his voice, only certainty. Bill nodded slowly. "All right, start with the basics. Don't rush. People don't like rushed work." Ethan nodded again. "Yes, sir." As he picked up the hose, his hands were steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he didn't have the option to be. At school, Lily moved quietly through the cafeteria. Her small frame blended easily into the crowd, her steps careful, her eyes scanning without drawing attention. She waited until most students had finished eating before approaching the edge of the serving area. A lunch lady stood there. Her name was Mrs. Green. Mrs. Green was an older woman, short and slightly round, with soft gray hair tucked under a cap, and kind eyes that noticed more than she let on. She had worked at the school for over 20 years, long enough to recognize hunger without being told. Lily hesitated. "Excuse me," she said softly. Mrs. Green looked down at her. "Yes, honey?" Lily glanced around briefly. "Do you have anything left over?" Mrs. Green's expression softened. She didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and turned, placing a small portion of food into a container. "Take this," she said quietly, "and come see me again if you need to." Lily nodded quickly. "Thank you." She held the container carefully as if it were something fragile, because to her, it was. At home, Noah lay curled under a thin blanket. His small body shivered slightly, his cheeks flushed with fever. His breathing was uneven, soft but strained. Angela sat beside him, placing a damp cloth on his forehead. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're going to be okay." But her voice wasn't as steady as before. Marcus watched from across the room, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. "We need medicine," he said. Angela nodded. "I know." But they both knew what came next. They didn't have the money. That evening, Angela stood in front of a small pawn shop. The sign flickered above the door. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. Behind the counter stood a man in his 40s, thin with sharp features and a voice that carried a constant note of disinterest. Angela placed something gently on the counter. Her wedding ring. It was simple, worn, but still held a quiet shine. The man picked it up, examined it briefly. "I can give you this much," he said, naming a number lower than it should have been. Angela didn't argue. She just nodded. Because arguing wouldn't change anything. She took the money, left the ring behind. The next morning, Marcus tried to return to the hospital. He moved slower this time, the pain in his legs worse than before. Angela supported him as they reached the front desk. Karen Doyle stood behind the glass again, her posture unchanged, her expression the same. "We need treatment," Angela said. "His condition is getting worse." Karen glanced at the file, then back at them. "I'm sorry," she said. "Without payment or insurance approval, we cannot proceed." Marcus stepped forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "This happened at work." Karen's expression didn't change. "You will need to take that up with your employer." Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded. Not in agreement, but in understanding. There would be no help here. That night, the house was quieter than ever. Ethan returned late, his clothes damp, his hands sore. Lily placed the food she had brought onto the table. Angela cooked what little they had. Marcus sat silently, watching his family. No one complained. No one asked for more. Because there was no more to give. Noah stirred slightly, still weak. Angela checked on him again. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time in a long while. He didn't know what came next. The town remained quiet on the surface, but something beneath it had begun to shift. Not in the ground this time, but in people. Inside the small newsroom, Emily Carter sat alone long after most of her colleagues had gone home. The overhead lights hummed faintly, casting a pale glow over stacks of notes, printed articles, and a laptop filled with drafts that had never been published. Her posture was rigid, her shoulders slightly tense as if she were holding herself together through sheer will. Emily had always believed in the idea that truth, once uncovered, could not simply disappear, but she had just watched it happen. And that changed something in her. She leaned forward, reopening her deleted article, not from the website, but from her personal backup. The words were still there. The facts hadn't changed. Only their visibility had. "They don't get to decide what matters," she murmured to herself. Her voice was quiet, but her decision was not. The next morning, Emily drove out of the city. Her car moved along a narrow road that led back toward the coal town, the landscape growing more worn and uneven the further she went. The houses became smaller, the spaces between them wider, as if distance itself had become a form of isolation. She stopped outside Marcus Johnson's home. For a moment, she remained in the car, observing. The house was modest, aging, its paint faded and edges worn. It didn't look like the kind of place that would hold a story large enough to threaten powerful people. But Emily had learned not to judge stories by appearances. She stepped out and approached the door. Angela answered. She looked at Emily carefully. Yes? Emily introduced herself, her tone respectful but direct. My name is Emily Carter. I'm a journalist. I'd like to talk about what happened at the mine. Angela's expression didn't soften. It tightened. We already talked to reporters, Angela said quietly, and then everything disappeared. Emily nodded. I know. Angela studied her for a moment longer. What makes you different? She asked. Emily didn't hesitate. I'm still here. That answer lingered. After a brief pause, Angela stepped aside. Come in. Marcus was sitting near the window again, his crutches resting beside him. He looked up as Emily entered, his expression calm but guarded. His body had not improved much. If anything, the strain of the past days had made his condition worse. But his eyes remained steady. Emily sat across from him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Marcus said, You're wasting your time. Emily met his gaze. I don't think I am. Marcus leaned back slightly. They buried it already, he said. Whatever you're looking for, it's gone. Emily shook her head. Not everything. She placed a small recorder on the table. Tell me what you saw, she said. Marcus looked at the device, then at Angela. Angela gave a small, almost invisible nod. Marcus exhaled slowly and began. He spoke about the cracks, the warnings, the ignored reports, the collapse, the moment the ground gave way, and the silence that followed. Emily didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. By the time Marcus finished, the room felt heavier. Not with fear, but with truth. Later that day, Emily sat in her car, replaying the recording. Every detail matched what she had already suspected, but now she had something more. A voice, a witness. She reached for her phone, hesitated, then dialed a number she hadn't planned to call again. Ryan Cole. Ryan sat in his apartment, staring at the same document he had signed days earlier, the non-disclosure agreement. It lay on the table in front of him, untouched since that moment. The room around him was quiet, but not peaceful. His apartment was small, neat, almost too organized, as if he had tried to control his environment to make up for everything else he couldn't. Ryan himself looked different. His posture was more rigid now, his movements more restrained. The uncertainty he once carried had hardened into something else, guilt. When his phone rang, he hesitated before answering. Hello? Ryan, this is Emily Carter. Silence, then. I can't talk, Ryan said quickly. Yes, you can, Emily replied calmly. And you should. Ryan's grip tightened around the phone. They made me sign something, he said. I know. They already are, Emily interrupted, and it won't stop unless someone says something. Ryan closed his eyes. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, what do you need? That evening, a small group gathered in an abandoned storage building on the edge of town. The space was dim, lit only by a few portable lamps. The walls were bare, the air cold. But the room was filled with something that hadn't been there before. People, workers, families, voices. Derek sat on a wooden crate, his injuries still visible but less severe than before. His arm was wrapped, his movements slower, but his presence unchanged. If anything, he looked more focused now. Angela stood nearby, speaking with a few women. She had changed too. The quiet endurance was still there, but now it carried direction. She listened carefully, connecting stories, remembering names, understanding who had been affected and how. She wasn't just part of the group. She was holding it together. Marcus sat slightly apart, his crutches beside him. He wasn't used to this, not the attention, not the conversations, but he listened, because for the first time, he wasn't alone. Ryan arrived last. He stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Emily. He looked out of place. Still. But he didn't leave. Emily approached him. "Did you bring it?" she asked. Ryan nodded. He handed her a small envelope. Inside were copies of internal reports, photos, documents, proof. They knew, Ryan said quietly, weeks before it happened. Emily looked down at the papers, then back at him. "This is enough," she said. Ryan didn't look relieved, just lighter. At home, later that night, Ethan sat in front of an old laptop. The screen flickered slightly, the connection unstable, but it worked. That was enough. He stared at the camera for a moment, unsure. Then he pressed record. "My name is Ethan Johnson," he began. His voice was steady, but soft. "My dad worked at the mine that collapsed." He paused, swallowed. "He got hurt, and now? We don't have anything." He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He just spoke. About his father, his family, the days without food, the nights without answers. When he finished, he sat there for a moment longer. Then he uploaded the video. He didn't know what would happen. He just knew he had to try. The next morning, the video began to spread. Slowly at first, then faster, one share, then another, then hundreds. People watched, commented, asked questions, and for the first time since the collapse, the silence began to crack. The change didn't come quietly this time. It began with a headline. Not hidden, not erased, but impossible to ignore. Emily Carter sat at her desk as the article went live, not on her old newsroom's website, but on an independent investigative platform known for publishing what others refused to touch. The screen in front of her glowed with bold text, sharp images, and documented proof. The title was simple, but it carried weight. They knew the truth behind the West Virginia mine collapse. Emily leaned back slightly, her fingers still hovering near the keyboard. She looked different now, not just tired, but resolved. Her green eyes no longer searched for permission. They held certainty. The article was thorough. Marcus's testimony, Ryan's documents, photos of the cracks. Internal reports marked resolved despite clear danger. Names were included, decisions traced. Responsibility pointed directly upward. Within minutes, the article began to spread. Within an hour, it was everywhere. In cities far beyond the small coal town, screens lit up with the same story. News stations picked it up. Radio hosts discussed it. Social media amplified it. The silence that once buried the truth was gone, and this time, it wasn't coming back. Back in the town, Marcus Johnson sat in the same chair by the window. But everything around him felt different. The house was still modest, the walls still worn. But the air carried something new. Movement, voices, hope. Angela stood near the doorway, holding her phone in her hand. "They're calling," she said, almost in disbelief. "Reporters, organizations, people asking how they can help." Marcus looked at her, then down at his legs. Still weak, still healing, but no longer defining him. "They want you to speak," Angela added softly. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Then I'll speak." 2 days later, Marcus stood, carefully, behind a small podium set up outside the town's courthouse. The sky above was clear for the first time in days, sunlight cutting through the cold air and casting long shadows across the gathered crowd. Cameras were everywhere. Microphones extended forward. People filled the space. Workers, families, strangers who had come because they had heard. Marcus adjusted his stance, leaning slightly on a support brace hidden beneath his clothing. His legs were still unstable, his movements measured, but he stood. That alone was enough to draw attention. Emily stood off to the side, watching. So did Ryan. So did Derek, his arms still wrapped, but his posture stronger than before. Marcus looked out at the crowd. For a moment, the noise faded. And then he spoke. "I worked in that mine," he began. His voice was steady, not loud, but clear. "I saw the cracks. We all did." A murmur moved through the crowd. "They told us to keep working," Marcus continued. "Told us everything was fine." He paused. "They were wrong." Silence followed, heavy, intentional. "And when it collapsed, when people got hurt," Marcus said, his voice tightening slightly, "they tried to make it disappear." He looked directly at the cameras now. "But we're still here." Behind him, Derek stepped forward slightly. Then another worker. Then another, not speaking, just standing, visible. The response was immediate. Investigations were reopened. State officials announced formal inquiries. Federal agencies became involved. The company that once stood untouchable now faced scrutiny from every direction. Charles Whitaker sat in a large office far removed from the dust and noise of the mine. But even here, the pressure had reached him. His composed expression had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. A screen in front of him displayed news coverage, Marcus speaking, Emily's article, documents being discussed openly. His assistant stood nearby, uncertain. "Sir, they're requesting your statement." Whitaker didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, control was slipping. Days turned into weeks. The investigation deepened. Evidence surfaced. More documents. More testimonies. Ryan was called in. So was Derek. So were others. Each story added weight. Each detail reinforced the truth. And eventually, it became undeniable. The company had known. Warnings had been ignored. Reports had been altered. Safety had been sacrificed, not by accident, but by decision. Charges were filed. Not quietly, not hidden. Publicly. Executives, officials, those who had signed off on silence. They were named. They were questioned. They were held accountable. For the first time, the system that had once protected them began to turn. Back in the town, the effects reached the people who had been waiting the longest. Marcus sat at the table with Angela as a letter lay open between them. Compensation, medical coverage, support for recovery. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and it had come because they refused to disappear. Angela reached across the table, placing her hand over Marcus's. "We made it," she said softly. Marcus looked at her, then nodded. "Yeah," he said, "we did." A new fund was established soon after, the Workers' Recovery Fund. It provided support for injured workers, education assistance for their children, and resources for families affected by industrial accidents. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it existed because people had refused to stay silent. Ethan returned to school. The first day back, he stood at the entrance for a moment, adjusting the strap of his worn backpack. He looked older now, not physically, but in the way he carried himself. When he stepped inside, it wasn't with hesitation. It was with purpose. His teacher greeted him with a smile. "You're back," she said. Ethan nodded. "I am." And this time, he didn't hide his notebook. Lily no longer waited until the cafeteria emptied. Mrs. Green still watched her carefully, but now with a different expression. Relief. Lily smiled more, a small change, but real. Noah ran through the yard outside their house, his laughter cutting through the quiet like something bright and undeniable. His health had improved, his energy returning piece by piece. "Dad, look!" he called out. Marcus stood nearby, leaning lightly on his support. "I see you," Marcus replied, smiling. Marcus no longer worked in the mine. He couldn't, but he found something else. Purpose. He began speaking. At small gatherings, then larger ones, about safety, about dignity, about what it meant to be heard. People listened, because his voice carried truth, not polished, not rehearsed, but lived. One evening, the family sat together at the table, the same house. But everything felt different. The plates were full, the room was warm. Angela set down the last dish and sat beside Marcus. Ethan, Lily, and Noah gathered around. For a moment, no one spoke. They just looked at each other. Then Noah grinned. "This is the best dinner ever," he said. Lily laughed softly. Ethan smiled. Marcus looked around the table, at his family, at everything they had been through, and everything they had held on to. He took a breath, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel heavy. This story reminds us of something simple but powerful. Silence in the face of injustice may feel like survival in the moment, but it cannot be a way of life forever. Every day, in small ways, we see unfairness around us. Sometimes we ignore it because we are afraid, because we feel powerless, or because we think it is not our place. But change always begins with someone who decides to speak, even when it is difficult. Justice may be delayed, it may be pushed aside, hidden, or ignored. But truth has a way of rising again, especially when people stand together. In our daily lives, this means choosing honesty over comfort, courage over fear, and kindness over indifference. It means treating others with dignity, no matter their background, their job, or the color of their skin. This story also challenges us to reflect. How do we treat people who are struggling? Do we look away, or do we care? Do we judge, or do we try to understand? Real strength is not in power, but in compassion and integrity. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone. You never know who might need to hear it today. Let your voice be part of something good. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what this story made you feel. Subscribe to the channel to support more meaningful stories like this. And wherever you are, may God bless you and your family with strength, peace, and hope. If you believe that light can rise even in the darkest moments, type Amen in the comments.